Welcome to the Convergent Impact Leadership Podcast, where we explore real leadership stories and strategies to inspire meaningful action and purpose. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting out, this podcast is here to help you lead with intent, build trust, and strengthen relationships in your organizations. I'm Eric Savickas, bringing over 30 years of leadership experience from my time as a retired U.S. Army officer, university instructor, and now currently as a leadership coach working with the fire service. Today, I'm joined by Division Chief Mark Schuman of Adams County Fire Rescue here in Colorado. Chief Schuman has been a dedicated member of ACFR since 1990 and was appointed as the Emergency Management Chief in 2019. Over his career, he served in many roles, including nearly a decade as training chief, and was named Colorado Fire Instructor of the Year in 2010. Beyond the department, Chief Schuman has taken on leadership roles across the region, serving as co-chair of the Urban Area Security Initiative North Central Region Training and Exercise Committee, and as a longtime contributor to emergency planning efforts at the county and state levels. His approach to leadership blends technical expertise with a clear focus on people, trust, and preparedness. Chief Schuman, welcome to the podcast. I am glad to have you here with me today.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here, sir.
So let's dig in and talk about your origin story. I like doing this with all of my guests. I want to hear what got you interested in the fire service in general, and then what got you into Adams County as your department, which has been, my understanding is it's been your department. I mean, it's gone through name changes, but your department the whole time.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of an odd tangent for my interest in the fire service. My brother was a poster child back in the day for Muscular Dystrophy Association from really dating myself, 1966 to 1972. And it was through his connections with the fire service, who's always been a strong supporter of Muscular Dystrophy Association, that I kind of learned who the firefighters were. As I got older, I became the youth chairman for muscular dystrophy, again, working with a number of fire agencies. It's where I met my first mentors in the fire service when I made the decision to get into the fire service. I wasn't sure I would ever be a good firefighter. I always thought of the calendar models, and that was not me. But one of the triggers, believe it or not, was I believe it was 1987, the airline crash at the old Stapleton Airport. Sitting at home thinking, gosh, I felt so helpless. I should be doing something. So I began the process of meeting with the firefighters that I had met through some of the fire agencies with MDA, got their guidance on where to begin, and started the process of first aid and EMT school. And then just by chance heard a story on the radio, of all places, that at that time it was North Washington Fire was hiring. It came across somebody who had lost his job and was angry about it, and thought, wow, I'll see if they're hiring. So that's the convoluted story of how I ended up with my agency. Really there have been bad days, but there's never been a day I haven't wanted to come to work.
If I could ask you follow up about the MDA stuff, did you find that when you were starting out in the department and some of the work and the connections that the fire service has with muscular dystrophy and supporting that cause, did you find that you were able to, as a side note to your general firefighting career, follow that passion a little bit? Did the department say, well, hey, if you're excited about this and you're clearly passionate about it, can you do some of this work on our behalf? I always think that that's such a great it's a great way to lead, right? If you can match up people's passions with things that need to be done when you're delegating work, right? Instead of just saying, well, you're the next in line to do this task, you're going to be on the color guard. If that's not your thing, it's a bad match. But if you're passionate about traditions and ceremony and other things, the color guard would be a great thing. Just as an example, if we could do that with firefighters, It's such a great match, and it makes people passionate and excited about what they do. Were you able to find that with the MDA stuff specifically?
Man, you're going to make this easy for me. It's exactly what happened. I was from the year I started as a rookie. It's one of those, nobody really wanted to be the chairman for the MDA drive. And those were in the days where we stood on the street corners from Friday evening through Monday afternoon. And it was in my wheelhouse. And working with MDA, I knew all the people already. It's kind of how my career has gone. I'm working with people I already knew. We were usually one of the top 3 fundraising agencies in the state, typically in the 35 to $50,000 per year range. And so, yeah, it was exactly what I needed to get that first leadership role, being able to coordinate the meals for the guys during the drive, and ended up being very successful. And it did give me that visibility that, finding that passion. I mean, that's most of my career has gone that way, and how I've modeled my leadership was from those early years of, my mentors, finding those things that I had a passion for and was involved with, and really got me where I am today.
And I honestly didn't know that you had done any work with the MDA before this conversation now, but it's funny because inevitably whenever I'm doing a leadership workshop or something, I use MDA stuff as an example. I say things like, "Hey, when you task a company or a part of a battalion to stand out in front of the King Supers, right? Are you doing it in mind with matching the right people with the right training with the right task, or you're just doing it because it's a task and someone's got to do it?" And I always mention like standing in front of the King Supers to fill the boot. And now I could say, like Chief Schuman, who was passionate about that kind of thing. I think that's great.
Thank you.
You mentioned your leadership and tapping into as how things started to resonate with you as a leader. How would you describe your leadership style? I know we throw around in the fire service a lot the term servant leadership. And sometimes, unfortunately, and I know I've mentioned this before, unfortunately, that tends to be more of a buzzword with not a lot behind it because whether out of necessity of just being more efficient, and just throwing the term out there and assuming that people know it. We don't get into a lot of the depth of what that actually means. So people in turn then just use it as a term without really understanding it. So whether that's your style or not, how do you describe your own personal leadership style?
Well, it's interesting you say that, and deflates me a little bit. My first real true mentor in the fire service was our fire chief at the second fire chief, Jim Notary, who taught classes on servant leadership and truly did live that life. He was always looking for ways to meld his people into what fits them best. In other words, instead of trying to create a firefighter that fit the calendar image, for example, that I used earlier, he was looking for, where did you find your niche? And I've always tried to do that, is to actually talk to my people. We've all had as leaders employees that were easy to work with. They knew what they wanted to do and how they wanted to get there, and were goal oriented and are pretty easy to manage. Then you have the ones that you have to push a little bit. I've always thought, instead of trying to push that round peg into a square hole, sometimes you need to change the hole, not the person. And so try and find that right hole. And so you really do I think there's a lot of self awareness involved in trying to be a good leader and try and find what works for your people, because the only way you're going to have employees that really are motivated and share the same goals and expectations is to have them involved and to have them integrated into your organization and in those areas where they fit best. And we all have the same core values of wanting to serve our communities and help people. There are very few that make it in the process that just want to wear the badge. They get weeded out pretty early. So you just have to find those areas. And our organization has always been great at being able to give people the leverage to find their sweet spot. It probably isn't really servant leadership, even though that's what I grew up in. I really try and be collaborative leader.
Mhm.
You can't you you can't demand respect. You can't lead people that don't want to be led. The only way to be able to make those things work is there's no one individual that gets along with everybody. That's just human nature. So what you have to do is have that collaboration. Say, all right, what is our common ground? What excites you and how can we get you there?
And it sounds like you're fully embracing, whether we agree that the term is servant leadership or not, you're fully embracing that mentality. And it sounds really good that that chief that first exposed you to it was teaching it in a way that caused people to understand it. Where I see some people getting off track with servant leadership is they believe it's a designation of the type of leader because we're in a service based profession, right? We serve the community, therefore we are servant leaders. Just like me in the military, I served the country, therefore I'm a servant leadership, which isn't that at all. It's that you exist as a leader because the crew exists
Yeah.
or the team exists. You're there to serve them and make them as good as they can be and be best at their job and be trained and do all the things associated with their roles. And you exist because of them, not the other way around, right? It's the leaders that get off track and think, I'm the leader to serve me and my own devices and my own things that I'm trying to do, which certainly there's part of it, right? Leaders have to have a vision and have to guide with intent and all that stuff. And they're in a position of authority for a reason. But I like to equate it to being like the lead blocker on a football team, right? That lead blocker isn't scoring touchdowns, but is facilitating that running back or whoever else to get through the hole and score the touchdown. And so I think that's really servant leadership. And I love how you articulated it. As you were coming up and promoting through the different ranks and the different positions that you held, was there an experience that stood out to you and challenged your leadership and maybe what you thought about leadership one day and then how that changed the next day? What did that look like, if anything stands out to you?
Well, the time that stands out was as a battalion chief, we shuffled our company officers around. And I got three officers from another shift. And we all know that shifts take on the personality of their leader. So, and the running joke is there's always a B shift. And ironically, these officers came from B shift and they came in and said, we're here to fix your shift, thinking that, we didn't fit their model. And so they needed to come and fix our shift. And so there were two lieutenants and a captain. And I sat down with the captain. I said, and he and I had he was a very black and white, his gray area was the seam and the carpeting. And my gray area tended to be the width of the room. And I said, we have to come together and find that happy medium. And this doesn't need to be adversarial. Let's find our common ground and work together instead of in opposition. And he and I really sat down and had some good heart to heart conversations. These officers learned that our shift really wasn't broken. And I think over the long term, first of all, let me know sometimes our own opinion of who we are and what we're doing isn't always reflected to those outside our immediate circle. And
Hmm.
so we have to be a little more self-aware of it doesn't mean we have to change, but we need to be more aware of what we look like to the other groups, not just other shifts, but does that transfer into the community and to, our elected officials and how are we perceived? Because perception is somebody's reality.
Sure.
And so I became, for me, the transition was I was much more transparent in how we operated. But I think for me, the victory in all this was when I was getting ready to leave the shift and to move into the division chief of training. I went around and met with all the officers so they would hear it from me that I was leading the shift, you know, the good of the whole organization instead of our one shift. And this captain looked at me and said, I'm getting ready to retire, and I had really hoped that I'd be able to retire with you as my battalion chief. And I thought, you know, it works.
Mhm.
Leadership doesn't have to be forced on anybody. It is truly collaboration.
And that's such a great compliment, right? It's personal, it's real, it's not filled with platitudes. It's just something that just hits home, right? That's so cool to hear. You spent a huge part of your career as the training chief and in training. My first introduction to the Colorado Fire Service community was via the training officers across Colorado in the CFTOA, and I believe that's where I first was introduced to you as well, pre-COVID, which seems like a lifetime ago. How does your experience as training chief kind of fuel your perspective on leadership and just taking care of people and mentoring them to be better?
You know, that's it's a great question because I never envisioned myself as being, um, a training officer and a leader in training, and much less being president of the training officers and being recognized as a fire instructor of the year. Those are just things I had never envisioned in my career, and I'm just so humbled by it. But I think it goes back to when you're leading an organization through training, you are the focal point of that organization. Everything we do in the fire service is based on training, whether it's answering the phone or fighting a structure fire or extricating somebody from a vehicle. It all comes from training. And if your training is good, I remember my first true introduction that I knew what I was doing as a firefighter was my first structure fire, where we arrived on scene and I didn't have to think about what I needed to do. My officer gave me instruction. I went and did it, came back, got new instructions, and realized I had that muscle memory that I didn't have to think about what I had to do. And that was my introduction, that training really matters in the fire service. And that if you're a good instructor, number one, you can make it fun. The highest compliment I got as an instructor is my my area of expertise, so to speak, is hazmat. I have taught hazardous materials most of my career, other than CPR. And when people leave a hazmat class and tell me I made hazmat fun, there's no greater compliment in that field than to have someone tell you that. And I think that has really been why I was so enamored with training, is I had fun doing it. And it also makes you, to quote the phrase, lifetime learner. To be a good training officer, you need to continue to learn. You can't just teach the same thing over and over again for a decade and expect it to be relevant. Your audience changes. We talk about different generations, and I've seen changes in generations. And the from when I started, where it was basically we did what we were told and didn't question, to now explaining why we do things,
Hmm.
and that it does matter why we do things, and to look at better ways. It isn't all cut and dry. There are better ways to do things, and shame on us if we aren't continually seeking out how to improve. And so I think that the training side of it has taught me how to that portion of finding somebody's niche. That's how you get those conversations started, is in training. And
Hmm.
you complement those things they do well, and you help coach them in those areas where they're struggling, and you allow people to fail without coming down on them. Failure is the best. Unfortunately, it's the best way to learn. And let's do it on the training ground. Let's
Yeah.
do it when it
Leader
really
leaders
doesn't
should
matter.
leaders should underwrite failure as long as
Yes.
we're learning lessons from those failures. I was I was laughing when you mentioned hazmat and how you had an ability to connect with people with hazmat. One of my sons was doing the fire academy up at Ames Community College, and he was like, "Dad, this hazmat stuff is kicking my butt. I have no idea what's going on." And I was reminding him, "Hey, you're spending good money, or more accurately, I'm spending good money on you going there. You better be passing this hazmat course." And he needed an instructor like you, apparently.
Well,
I think as you were talking about training and talking about how you're connecting to people as a trainer, an effective trainer, and understanding what makes people tick and getting the most out of them in training, it's a clear segue into what I wanted to ask you about next. This month, I'm talking about emotional intelligence as an essential leadership skill that I think we all need to practice and we all need to work on. And largely, and this isn't an indictment on anyone in particular, but largely we all do it pretty poorly and can improve. We say things like mission first, people always. And I know Randy Royal was just talking about that, and he talks about that a lot. And I was exposed to that in the military a lot. But often we just say it and it's the mission that's the thing. The people always becomes an afterthought. How do you particularly model understanding and being empathetic and self awareness and relationship building, especially in situations where you're under pressure when sometimes that is or seems like at least it could be the optional stuff when it's the mission that's staring you in the face? How do you do that? And maybe tie it back into training as well, because you just talked about it so eloquently about how good trainers connect. That's what it's all about. What do you think?
I fully agree. I had this conversation the other day that part of having that relationship building under pressure, think a good leader, one of the things they have to do is know their people and their capabilities and work on their strengths, work on, in particular, have them help each other in those areas where they need improvement and continually interact with your crew in training. You can't just send them off and say, hey, go through ladders until you get better. A leader needs to be invested. And I think what we don't always see is the better you know your crew and the more confidence you have in them, the more that shows under pressure. In other words, I never had a crew where I arrived on scene and didn't feel comfortable they knew what they were doing, regardless of what I asked them to do. I used to get teased when I actually had to use my chief voice because I rarely did. It was, it's sometimes it was, the duck in water. On the surface, it looked pretty calm and I was paddling 100 miles an hour. The first time we had a report of people trapped in a home and we had to make the decision to go defensive because of the fire conditions. You know, Nobody questioned me. It was they trust me because I trust them. And it really does come down to trust. And that trust can only be built with having that, we call it self awareness. You have to know who you are in order to project that to your crews. I always started our after action reports with what I did wrong or what I could improve on because I review all of them now and I get a little frustrated when I don't see, areas where we could improve because no call goes perfect. It doesn't happen unless you show up and you get to leave and you didn't get in an accident. Otherwise, there's always something that can go better. And so my crew understood and my shift when I was battalion chief and even in training always understood that I would reflect back on myself first. And then when we did have things where we had areas for improvement, nobody took it personal. We could have the discussion and they would readily admit, yeah, I probably could have done this better. And so I think we talk about rank and we talk about respect, and everyone understands that they have to respect rank. But it doesn't do any good if they don't respect the person behind the badge. And we all know that that is earned, but not everyone understands how to earn that. And I think part of it is exactly that human centered leadership, that ability to connect more than just do this job, the mission first. It has to go back to, you know, find their strengths, let them work in those areas, understand where their limitations are, and try and get them to improve in those areas. And as we talked about earlier, have to allow them to fail. Failure happens. And if we are always criticizing and punishing for failure, then that's the focus, not trying to get better.
Yeah. Sometimes I wish it would be so much better if we had a clear, like, calculator or some sort of a visual status that you could see. Like, I could get this much out of my people if I'm just that hard ass leader that is very task focused, telling them what needs to happen, holding to the standard. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if that's my way, I'm going to get X amount out of them. But if you could see, like, visually or through some sort of a tool, like if you make those connections and you tap in with empathy as the human to human connection and you really figure out what makes someone tick and what they're going through and how to get the best out of them, how much more you can get out of that and be more productive as a crew and be more effective and still do all of the great fire stuff that we need to do. Like, that would be the lesson that hits home. Like, sometimes I feel like, when I go into these workshops and I talk about empathy and I talk about emotional intelligence and I talk about some of these other things that people in either the military or the fire service think are squishy and soft and unnecessary. Sometimes I'm talking myself blue in the face, but if you could just show them, look at what you get from this, maybe that will be the thing that clicks.
Well, I think one of the, again, going back to an example, I had to write up my engineer at one time. People make mistakes, and so
Hmm.
we had our little discussion. And as he got up to leave, he reached out, shook my hand, and he said, "You know what I like about you, Chief? You can sit across the table from me, you know, call me an a-hole, and when it's all over, I'll thank you for it." And at first, I didn't understand how to take that, and then I realized that was really a compliment in that, I didn't chew him out. He made a mistake. I pointed it out. We talked about, what he needed to improve on. And, we could go out and have dinner afterwards and sit around the table and yuck it up without having this battle because you're authoritarian in your discipline. Or, I've always felt that, there's a time and a place where, you have to use your chief voice, but it's rare, it's few and far between. Most of the time, you can ask people to do things, you can
Hmm.
treat them with respect, and you'll get that back.
Yeah, definitely. So you've had exposure not only to your work in Adams County at the department level, but you've worked at the state and regional levels on various projects, and I named some of those in the bio there. How has that stuff shaped your larger perspective and your own personal leadership?
The interesting part about and thinking about that is I've learned a lot about political capital, something that in the fire service, in the company officer level or even in a chief officer level within your agency, you don't think about. When you start working at a regional level and especially at the state level, you look at as you're trying to lead projects that you are trying to convince people of something that they have in some cases no interest in or have alternate or agendas, sometimes their own personal agendas, and that building political capital is something that it's somewhat equal to earning that respect as an individual with your crew. Now you're trying to do the same thing with people who have different motivations than you do. They might be elected officials, they might be appointed, but their priorities aren't the same as yours.
Hmm.
And that you still have to collaborate. You have to do a lot more selling. And, sometimes you have to lose the battle to win the war. And that's something that as a firefighter, we're not good at. We don't like to lose at anything. And sometimes you have to make sacrifices, for lack of better terms, a greater good. And sometimes you just flat out lose. And so I think that I've learned that, trying to collaborate and build that political capital with those that have the similar beliefs you do or the same motivation you do really is a little bit more unique working in outside of just the fire service.
So you learned As you were describing some of those lessons through your more senior experiences in that work at the state and the regional level and other positions and political capital as you just described and the power of collaboration, et cetera. Do you think that those are good things to articulate to new fire officers that are stepping into their first leadership role? Or if not those, what in your hindsight now, looking back over the course of your long and distinguished career, would you tell somebody that's new? Like, well, I know those are the basics. You got to communicate, lead by example, articulate with intent, and all those other things that we talk about in leadership courses. But what's like a thing that you would say, remember this to a new leader?
So, what I've tried to get across when I've brought on new leaders, my comment to them, my advice to them is everything you do is built on a foundation of trust. If your crew trusts you, then they'll go to the ends of the earth for you. They'll do almost anything you ask. And I do say almost because there are always those exceptions. But no, if
Hmm.
they truly trust you, you can you can create a great crew. I had an officer candidate, somebody I never thought I'd quote. And I don't know that it's his original quote, but in talking to him about what he expected from his crews, he said, I don't expect them to be the best. I expect them to be great. And I thought that I've used that ever since because I think that's a perfect example of what the leader should be. You're not always going to be the best. I mean, if you really look at it, only one person can be the best at any one thing. Everyone else falls below that, but you can be great without being the best. And I think
Hmm.
that can be accomplished if they trust who you are and what you're doing. And that trust is on many levels, not just, an officer has to have the knowledge base to make the proper decisions, but they also have to understand, like we talked about earlier, those emotional needs of their crews, connect on that personal level that, hey, this is who I am. I understand who you are. We're going to make this work and let's move forward. And whether it's cleaning toilets or fighting a commercial structure fire, they'll follow you.
Yeah, definitely. Let me give you one last question, if I can, Chief. So, about a month or so ago, there was this social media trend going around, and I don't mean to scare you off by mentioning social media if you're not down with social media, but bear with me here. There was a social media trend going around where people were using AI stuff, and through AI, they were building these action figures of themselves, like visual action figure images of themselves. And through AI, you had to put in like descriptors of what your thing was or what you did. And so when I was fooling around with it, like me as a leadership trainer, I put in include like my laptop and my flip chart paper and whatever. And so it builds out the thing. So I'm just thinking about this and just riffing here. But if we were going to build the Chief Mark Schuman leader action figure, give me a couple of ingredients that would go into that.
Wow.
Like what is your secret sauce that would go into you being the action figure that you are?
So I'm going to go a little off base here because I know
All
you're
right.
asking for kind of me as a firefighter, but I think one of the most driving forces in my life is he's actually 30-year-old son who has cerebral palsy. And he has no hate. He doesn't understand a lot of emotions. He doesn't understand, he knows when he's sad, but he doesn't understand the concept of hate. So he loves everybody. He likes everybody. Everybody is equal to him. And I'd have to have him in the background because he guides everything I do. We should all look at everybody as a friend, as an equal. I think that that's a driving force for me is let let's, the old Chief Brunacini be nice concept. That's who he is. He knows when he's not feeling well or when he's hungry. The rest of the time he's laughing because everything is fun to him. And so that's what I'd want to be. Other than that, if you really look at my career, what I'd want in the background, I'd probably have to have some type of hazmat logo, like the NFPA 704 diamond. probably have uh, dating myself, but, have a whiteboard behind me. Because I really do. I never thought I'd like anything as much as I did training, but I'd have to have something for emergency management, maybe a little tornado r-
There
drawn
you
on the
go.
whiteboard. And I'd like, I think, images of my crews because they all molded me as well. I've always, and I know it's very cliche, but I am where I'm at because of the people I worked with. Some of them I worked for, but most everyone I've worked with. And I think that a class picture of the people that have worked with me, collaborated with me, that's that would be who I am.
Yeah, no, I think all of that is great. And I think that's the perfect stopping point for us here with our conversation, Chief. What you just articulated is the person that makes you that real life action figure, that superhero. Not that you necessarily as a individual are more super than anyone else, but as a leader, a superhero in that you get it and that you understand what it means to lead and lead well and take care of people and all of that. I think was just a great point to sum things up. So thank you so much for sharing that and sharing all your other insight and experiences with us today. Your decades of leadership and commitment to both emergency preparedness and people-centered leadership, as you mentioned, are making a real difference and will continue to make a real difference for years to come. For our listeners, if you found this episode valuable, please share it with your team or anyone who might benefit from these leadership takeaways. Don't forget to subscribe to the Convergent Impact Leadership Podcast and leave a review on your favorite platform. For more leadership resources and tools, visit convergentimpact.com. And until next time, lead well, take care of your people, and keep setting the example.